righty, we're gonna go ahead and get started. Welcome to Planning While Black in a Crisis. My name is Idemudia. I will be your moderator / host for this discussion. I am so excited to have you all here. I am so excited to have our guest here, and we're about to get into it. So I am the Director of Planning at MUSE Community Design. MUSE Community Design was founded 5 years ago. We're a Chicago-based firm. We were founded by Courtney Kashima. We do a myriad of things, including transportation planning. We do outreach and engagement. We do zoning and land use. But what sets us apart from a lot of people is that everything that we do is centered around equity and fighting for society's most vulnerable communities. And so this event is actually the third of a 3-part series that we are doing around Candid COVID Conversations. And so when we created this event, when I thought of this particular subject, Planning While Black, it was to talk about the things affecting the Black community surrounding COVID. But as we all know, racism really came through and stole COVID's thunder. It's always existed, but it's definitely blown up and come to the consciousness of a lot of people, thankfully or not thankfully, over the last few weeks. And so we think that this conversation is timely and very much needed. A few housekeeping things. You should be on mute. If you'd like your pretty face to be shown or your handsome face to be shown, that's great. Feel free to talk in the comments as we're going through our conversation, because I'm sure there will be a lot of things that you may want to say, whether you agree, whether you disagree, whether you want to do some hand snaps or whatever you want to do. Go ahead and feel free to engage in the comments. We will be having an open Q&A at the end of this. This is a 90-minute session. So, the first hour or so will be our conversation, our kitchen table talk, as I like to say, and then we'll be opening up probably the last 20 minutes to questions. One thing I want to do is set the tone. As you heard as you were coming in, this is definitely a space that was created by Black planners for Black planners. This is something that we feel like is much needed for our specific community, and we're inviting our non-Black allies to watch and engage with us. But this is not a racism 101. We're not going to have any explanatory comments during this session. So if you thought that that's what you were getting during this, I'm sorry. I'm sure there's plenty of sessions out there for you, but this is not it. Even the verbiage of panel comes with its own, what professionalism means, and that's also steeped in white supremacy. This is not that. We are coming here as Black planners as our full selves, and we want you to be able to come here as your full self as well. And so I just want to set that tone and be very clear about that. And before I start and introduce our guest, what I would like to do is just take a moment to breathe and take a moment of silence for all of those who we've lost in our community due to COVID-19, to all those that have been victims of police brutality, and all those who have been murdered at the hands of sexual predators, with special emphasis on our trans brothers and sisters, who are a group that are especially vulnerable to violence in our society. So I just want to take a moment of silence for them. Okay. All right, so what I'm gonna do is I'm gonna start introducing our dynamic speakers. I am so excited. One, that I could get on their schedules and that they would return my emails. First, I'm gonna start with my girl, Kristin Gordon, who is the Economic Development Deputy for Councilmember Marqueece Harris-Dawson in Los Angeles. She's born and raised in Los Angeles. She'll be the first to tell you that. She is an urban planner committed to equitable development. She currently serves as the economic development for District 9 in Los Angeles, where she focuses on housing, economic development, transportation, and planning for more than 250 South Los Angeles residents. Ms. Gordon It holds a BA in Urban Studies from the University of California, Irvine, and a certificate in real estate from the University of Southern California. And Kristen is just like one of literally my best friends. We talk all the time. We were baby planners together at the City of Los Angeles. And when I asked her to be on this panel, it was more of like, okay, so you're gonna be on this panel. Let me send you an email so you can say yes. So I'm so excited to have her here today. Next, I want to introduce you to Dr. Matthew Miller. I will never get tired of saying that. Dr. Miller is a Provost Postdoctoral Fellow at the University of Pennsylvania's School of Design. Dr. Miller is a cultural geographer, visual anthropologist, and urban design researcher based at the University of Pennsylvania School of Design. His teaching and research focuses on animating public space, Black geographies, and resilience and sustainability, and visual storytelling. Dr. Miller has published in academic journals such as Planning Theory and Practice and Duke University Press. His first forthcoming solo authored book focuses on transdisciplinary notion of Black urbanism by mapping how Blackness influences small businesses and placemaking in Los Angeles. Miller's street photography has been commissioned by the University of Washington in Seattle and the Whitman School of Design. He is also an emerging scholar at the Penn Institute for Urban Research. Welcome, Dr. Miller. Me and Matthew go way back when I thought I wanted a PhD. That didn't really work out for me, but I am so proud of you that you've made it. And like I said, I never get tired of calling you a doctor. So thank you for participating tonight. And last but not least, we have Kalia Burt Gaston, who is the founder and president of Guidepath Strategies in Detroit, Michigan. Kalia is an advocate for inclusive and equitable communities. As a trained urban planner, her work has been featured in Next City, Dwell Magazine, the New York Times, Huffington Post, Chicago Public Radio, and Harvard Family Research Project. She served as program officer at one of the country's largest private philanthropic foundations, where she provided leadership for efforts that spanned education and learning, maternal child health, and workforce development. Before that, she held positions in nonprofit and governmental sectors, leading community development efforts, focusing on real estate development. Kalia's leadership and expertise has been critical to the success of initiatives totaling $500 million, okay? Coins. So thank you so much. And I also would just like to say my new chapter soror, I could not be so, I'm just so filled with love and gratitude that you decided to join this panel, but two, that you've been a mentor to me in planning. That has been awesome, and that I could call on you whenever I have a question. That's been amazing. And thank you so much for sitting in this discussion, this kitchen table talk. Okay.
Thank you.
So these are their pictures. Look at this Black excellence. Just look at it. So before we get started into the discussion, we are raising funds for organizations throughout the 4 cities that are represented in this conversation today. The GoFundMe link is in the discussion box below. Please, if you find it in your heart to donate, we are donating those funds to amazing organizations, like I said, across the country. In Chicago, we've chosen a Brave Space Alliance, which is a Black and trans-led LGBTQ+ center dedicated to providing resources and programming to queer people on the South and West sides. The group is also pushing for queer and trans inclusivity into the Black Lives Matter movement. Force Detroit is a culmination of interfaith, grassroots, and public sector leaders committed to having hard conversations about complex community issues, pushing boundaries, and generating creative, justice-oriented solutions. They leverage media around relevant strategies to connect those least likely to be engaged in civically. And then in Philadelphia, we have Beach Companies, which is a longstanding Black-owned CDFI in North Philly. The original mission of Beach was that of grant making and foundation to support community services. Their foundation arm has been giving out $1,000 micro grants to businesses and nonprofits hit by the COVID-19 crisis. And then last but not least, we have Destination Crenshaw in Los Angeles. It is an unprecedented community-led project seeking to counterbalance cultural erasure and celebrate and preserve the heart of Black Los Angeles through infrastructure, art, and small business support. The money raised through tonight's efforts will be used for the Crenshaw High School Community Garden Project in collaboration with Make Crenshaw Great Again. Alrighty, that was a mouthful, but I made it through. And then last but not least, I would like to thank all of the firms who are matching the funds tonight. So if you donate funds, it's actually like you donating funds times 4. So not only is MUSE matching funds, but HPZS is matching funds, Mercer Planning Associates is matching funds, and FAR Associates. So I thank all the firms who have put their money where their values are, and I hope that there are other firms out there that will join our effort to give back to the communities. So I'm going to exit out here, and we're going to start with our conversation. So what I want to do is just like, let's just start with, how are you all doing during these times? I mean, we're already usually stressed as Black folks just living in America, but how are you feeling during these times? And then also, how are you finding joy, even in turmoil? So whoever wants to go first, Kalia, if you want to go first, you can go ahead.
Sure. Thanks, everyone. Thanks to MUSE and for the invitation. It's wonderful to be on the panel this evening. I think for me, first of all, it's been a difficult time. There's no way around it. We're here in Detroit, which was a hot spot nationally initially for COVID-19. Unfortunately, our community has suffered. We've lost a number of community practitioners, a number of our elders within our community, and people who've really been involved throughout arts and culture and politics here in the city of Detroit. So it's been a rough time, but it's also, been a time for me of respite and reflection. I have 2 young children, so it's also been a time where I've had to step in and homeschool as well. So I think, I told my friends, this is too much, too much, especially as we had the, killings of, our Black brothers and sisters here in Detroit and across the country. And so for me, I felt like COVID already had me on edge, and then the protest and the violence kind of took it over the edge. And normally I'm very, I'm talkative, I'm engaged, but I found myself really retreating into myself because I needed to create joy and to nurture joy. There's the saying, how Black joy is resistance. And so it was imperative that we create joy within our home, that we create joy for, our children. And for us, that meant we didn't tell our oldest everything that was going on in the world. We limited our interaction with media and with television and with radio. And so, I also used this time to reconnect, especially as the protests were going on, with people who were on the front lines. I have planning colleagues across the country, and, I wanted to talk to them to see how they were feeling, to see what I could do from my place of privilege to really help and push the needle on some of the policy recommendations. And I think it was my imperative, I felt, as someone who wasn't on the front lines, to support the movement, not to be critical, not to criticize, not to feel like the wording wasn't right, but to get behind what was happening within our community. And I would also say, to create, as a planner, my Black utopia. So we've also been digging in the dirt and planning plans and soaking up the sun, in the backyard. So that's how we've been, getting by here in Detroit.
I'm gonna go ahead and go next. Yes to the Black utopia. I think for all the Black planners on this call, maybe we should set up a huddle Nina and I joke about this all the time, but I think, let's go from jokes to reality. Because I think we need it. But one, Nina, I just want to say thank you for posing this question, because I think in these moments of heaviness, it's really easy to forget to center our joy. We might feel guilty about centering our joy. I know I have felt that way. But like the last few months have been a lot, everything changing. Every day is different. And then for the last few weeks to be compounded on top of that, I agree with Khalilah, like it was just too much. And I personally experienced really unhealthy levels of rage and hopelessness in 2013 through 2015. And so it was really important that I tried to maintain a balance this time around and be mindful of what I take in and what I take on in terms of the amount of information that is flowing. So that might mean logging off for the week. And maybe if I think where I'm at now is I might get on social media at the end of the day. So I can catch up on things, and just taking time I've just been going inward a lot, meditating a lot, writing, reflecting, sharpening the toolbox, because we are in this for the long haul. And so I'm trying to build myself up so we can all sustain through this and then hold space for people to continue to sustain in this. So that's really what I've been doing, checking in on my friends, family, loved ones, folks who I know are on the front line, and just trying to create space for us. Another thing I've dived into recently, as we talk about Black utopias, I'm really starting to get into Octavia Butler's work in Afrofuturism, because sometimes I'm not a big person I'm not big on science fiction, but I'm trying to spark my imagination more and start to think beyond the confines and the constraints of the world we live in. So that's what I've been finding myself doing the last few weeks.
Wow, that's beautiful. You all have sounded like you've been doing a lot of community-based work, and I'm really grateful for people that are doing that. I think one tactic, I guess, that my partner does a lot that I wasn't really too fond of before all this was like napping. There's like a really great.
Nap.
Yeah, like rest is resistance. Nap ministry is a profile that somebody with me.
Yeah.
And I was like, oh my gosh, like I did not see the need for that. I see somebody in the comments, nap ministry is real. Yes, I'm a believer. But so that's been great. I don't know, I have like I love this question as well, because a lot of my work focuses on culture, Black culture. And I think a lot of times, even with that study, those studies, it feels like you have to justify it in terms of politics and in terms of usefulness and not just for its inherently intrinsic, value to yourself. And so that's what I've been trying to do. I've gotten into RuPaul's Drag Race a lot. A lot of beauty, protective styles that I normally wouldn't do to my hair because I have to go out and about. I've been able to savor up indoors. And then just I don't know, it's like justice and beauty. Like those are the two things that I feel like I've been really re-energized and rejuvenated to see. I really feel like we're in a moment where we're gonna win. We've been winning, and that's kind of, not to get too far into some of the thoughts for later in the conversation, but that's the space I've been trying to exist in, and I guess that's my Black utopia. When you said that, I was like, oh my God, I just got this in the mail.
We vibing. We on the same wavelength.
Yeah, definitely.
Yes. Awesome. Well, yes, I think centering Black joy in this time is so important for ourselves, but then also for the world to see. Clearly, we've been a resilient people since the beginning of time, and we have to continue to practice those things, but also make space to feel sad and to feel angry and to feel upset. All of that, we're not a monolith. We are not one note. I mean, shoot, yeah, like in one day I could be smiling and crying in a span of 10 minutes. So yeah. So one of the first questions I want to get into is about how, me personally, like I've been really reflecting a lot over the last few months about our profession's role in perpetuating institutional racism and my place in the profession as a Black person, right? Like, our mere presence within this profession, in this institution, is political. And oftentimes, as Black professionals, as Black urban planners, we are met with a myriad of microaggressions, macroaggressions, straight up racism, but we've decided to be within the system for whatever reason. And so, I think we can all agree that, like I said, our very presence is political. And I think about some of the times in which, like, from a little kid and seeing the built environment, growing up in Detroit, but going to school in the suburbs, riding the bus back and like up and down 8 Mile, right? Because I was from the east side and going to the suburbs and taking the public transit every single day, rain, sleet, whatever, sun, and seeing the physical difference as I was riding to school every day and seeing what my classmates had in their neighborhood versus what I had in mine. And then as I got to become a professional urban planner and going to one of my first interviews, and the director of this small city in Los Angeles County saying, "Oh, I almost threw your resume out because I saw your undergrad degree was in African American studies and women's studies, and I didn't understand why you wanted to be a planner. Like, why do you want to work for us?" Like, he literally told me this in my interview, that he almost threw my resume out, but he ended up hiring me. And I was the best thing that ever happened to them, but that's a whole nother story. But then also to now being in like organizations, planning organizations, and seeing the microaggressions and seeing people say like, "Oh, I've never seen that person. Like, I've been in this industry for a long time and I've never met that person. Who are they? They need to explain their mere existence in the profession to me, as if you have claim over this, as if you have claim over this profession." They do let more than 10 of us in at a time now, so you might not know us all, so those types of things. So I want to know from you all, like, what was your first experience with Blackness and racism in the built environment? And then also, what was your first experience as a planner, and do you feel conflicted about even using the term planner?
Go, Kristen.
Right, Kristen looked like she want to jump at it.
Right.
Oh, you're on mute.
Y'all would think by now, how many months are we into Zooming? I would learn how to turn mute off. But anyways, I think to Nina's point, like, born and raised in LA, Nina said I was going to tell y'all that. And growing up in South LA in particular, I think a lot of the experiences around me, I was just taught to normalize, and we were all taught to normalize. So the idea of driving extra miles to get food or go shopping, not really being able to enjoy parks. I remember in planning school, people talking about parks and open space, and I was like, I don't go to parks, the fuck? Because either they weren't accessible, they weren't well maintained, or, they were occupied by gangs, and I didn't necessarily at the time, like, know or have the language to be able to explain why that was happening. And I think, the moment where I remember consciously questioning my experiences and connecting them to race was definitely on those moments being bussed out of my neighborhood to go to school in Rancho Palos Verdes, which is a white, wealthy community in Los Angeles County. And like, I remember my parents, at the time I lived in Inglewood, there was this liquor store on the corner. My parents would never let us go to it. They would never let us walk to it, right? Like, it was always like, don't walk. If we go, you're gonna get driven over there, and it's literally like 4 blocks away, like not that deep. But at the same time, when I got out of school in middle school in Palos Verdes, they let me walk all across that neighborhood and go to Starbucks and all of this stuff. And just really, like, that was a time where I really got to see that tale of two cities play out, and then see it and hear it be reinforced in the experiences of other people around me, for a lot of us who went through kind of that busing experience. And then I think, for the profession, I say this often, I don't necessarily spend a lot of time in our field, in some of the formal spaces that are set up for planning professionals. And I don't necessarily identify as an urban planner. The word urban just doesn't always sit right with me. I think that word has been used as code for Black people or those people, and it just doesn't sit with me. But anyways, so I just think of myself as someone who thinks about space, and Black space in particular, and how Black people, we get to experience space, how we create joy in that space, how we rise above our spaces. And so that's the way I think about it. And I just really think that a lot of we've created this profession and we've given ourselves these titles, but the expertise really lies in our communities. The people who know best how to plan their communities are the people who are experiencing them on a day-to-day. And so I think about, like, how do I use those tools and knowledge to facilitate more and more people in my community being able to call out the conditions that we live in and be able to be in a space to change them.
Wow. That was so poetic. I definitely think it was hard to answer this question because it was like, well, how far back do I really want to go? As far as, like, you know, experiencing racism in the built environment. A lot of my formative experiences in childhood were sort of split up in a bunch of different places. And when I think about that aspect of Blackness, like you mentioned busing, Kristen, and like my mom and her sisters were bused. And for us, my parents, like, we had like a 2-bedroom apartment in like Mountain View, but like most of our time was spent in East Palo Alto during the day. And if you're familiar with the Bay Area at all in the 90s, like East Palo Alto had a lot of issues. Still has some issues, but it's the crime and all those things are different now. And I remember us, like, you know, having different rules around like being able to walk around freely in East Palo Alto versus in Mountain View. I remember, you know, like my grandmother was like big on taking us on walks, but it was only like certain times of the day. And like, she would always have these phrases where it was like, you know, Lord, this is so crazy. I've never said this in public, but I was doing some reflection of the day. And she was like, Lord, like, scan my eyes to find some money. Like, she was like very, very like intent on us finding like things along the trail, made it almost like an adventure. But it was, you know, we can never go to a grocery store to go use any money we found. Like, we'd have to go, you know, drive across the highway. Mountain View or East Palo Alto didn't have any grocery stores at the time. So I think back to those experiences, and I feel like the built environment was shaped in such a way, particularly in East Palo Alto, where there was a lot of movements to make it its own city and like separate itself as a Black space from Palo Alto in the 60s and 70s. And so it just led to a lot of fracturing of essential services. But yeah, I've been like really thinking about that a lot. I was drawn to go into urban planning because of environmental racism. Like, I remember one issue in East Palo Alto was that we had a lot of, you know, we had water quality issues. Like, my grandmother was always like holding up the glass in the air, like when she turned it on and stuff when we were growing up. Just really like skeptical of the water quality. And a lot of environmental youth organizers actually were the ones who they're called Romic environmental technologies, where they overcame them and got the EPA to finally close them down. And so I was always just like, I want to do something that could help, you know, prevent those kinds of things from happening. And people were like, urban planning, you know, urban planning, land use, zoning, like those are the things that shift burdens or benefits into certain communities. And so that was where I started in urban planning. But to the question around like, you know, experiencing just like cognitive dissonance maybe, or just some issues with the title of planning and like what it's like. I've been on more on the academic side of things, dipped in and out to do like internships and political work and stuff along the way. But just like the microaggressions, you know, like people saying that like I write well for being Black, or like, you know, saying that like, you know, I had my thesis. Yeah, really. So one of my professors had told me once when I submitted a thesis that like, you know, there's this tradition where you dress up as a version of your paper, and my paper was called "Did Pookie Get a Green Collar Job?" So they said, which was funny. I give them that, you know, okay, but like they were like, let's dress up as Pookie, and I'm like, really? Like, what does that mean? Like, it's just weird, awkward stuff like that. But yeah, those things make it hard to feel a sense of belongingness sometimes in academic planning. Is just the cultural ignorance sometimes. I really didn't know if I felt like I had issues with being called a planner. I've always felt like I wanted to expand what it means to be a planner. So like I've come up with my own like terms for myself. I think of myself as an urban witness, I think of myself as a Black world builder. And I think of myself as a wordsmith, particularly culturally. Like, Black people don't have a lot of terms to describe like what we're seeing and feeling, and really structuring our own experiences into the profession of planning. And so that's what I've been focused on, and that's what's kept me involved, engaged. I think a lot of doubts I had about that have been assuaged recently. You know, people that I've returned studies back to show them, hey, is this right? You know, whatever. And they're like, you know, gosh, like, I've been wanting to say that. I haven't had the words to say it. And like, thank you. And so that feels really good to feel like, okay, the structuring role is relevant for making people feel like they can be planners too.
Mm-hmm. Now, I loved Urban Witness.
Yeah,
that just really spoke to me. I think, like everyone else, you know, in the discussion, I was introduced to planning just in my community. Before I launched this iteration of my consulting practice, it was called Madison and 14th Consulting. And Madison and 14th was the intersection where I grew up. And that was the epicenter of my world in Anderson, Indiana, which is an inner-ring suburb of Indianapolis. And so, you know, we lived in a live work, right? Before it was a live work. We owned a business in the front, which was a flower shop. And my mom, my father, and I lived in the back. I walked to school. I had 3 generations within my community. And so that city, that community, you know, raised me, it birthed me, it set me on a path toward higher education. And so when I went away to college and came back and saw just the decline of my community that I loved so much, I was like, what is this? I need to know more about why we're losing jobs, you know, why the crack epidemic, right, is raging within our communities. But I didn't have words for what that was as a profession. And I was blessed to really be introduced to planning from another Black planner. She's actually on this call today, my friend for 25 years, Courtney Nello. So we worked together in a job. It was in a school of social work, and I was just pouring out my heart and talking to her about, you know, my community, what I wanted to do. And she said, that's urban planning. You need to look at urban planning for graduate school. And so that, you know, opened up a whole new world for me, you know, being a student. And, but the microaggression started then, right? In planning school, whether it was through, you know, professors, whether it was through your peers. But really my first kind of interaction with the built environment from a professional standpoint was working for a large nonprofit in Detroit, which really was in charge of, you know, downtown development here in the city. And, you know, I was the token, right? I was the Black planner who was brought in because there were no Black faces. There was, you know, hardly any Black representation on the board. And, you know, I had plans, right, for what I was going to do, how I was going to make my mark, right? I was fresh out of planning school. And I remember being told that I needed to sit, enjoy my view, enjoy my nice salary, but that I wasn't going to get an opportunity to really engage in the work. And I was told that just flat out, right? Enjoy your salary, enjoy this corner office, but I have no intention of engaging you in this work. And so as a young Black planner, I then, right, had to think, how am I going to pivot? Because I can't afford to be in a professional setting, right, where I'm not getting called into meetings, where I'm not getting a chance to show what I can do, but also, you know, use the degree that I took out loans for, right? And so I decided to pivot. And so, you know, my career has been one that's been really multidisciplinary. I've worked in the for-profit sector. I've worked in state government. I've worked at the neighborhood level. And I always identify as an urban planner, but I like the fact that my career hasn't been the traditional route. You know, as you mentioned before, I've worked in philanthropy, and, you know, planners have a unique way, right, of looking at what's happening now and connect it to, you know, the growth of cities historically. I also think my shift in my career path really aligned with, Detroit being hot again. So, I found really as a Black planner being pushed out of conversations and being alienated from certain tables because Detroit was taking off. We had people from all over the country moving to our city and getting jobs in planning with no planning background, right? Never read a book, don't know any theories about how, cities are built. And so I just thought it's time for me to exit and do something different. But I'm appreciative really because, this panel, has been an introduction for me back into the field. In consulting now, I have an opportunity to work with a lot of community development, nonprofits. And so I'm, finding that lane again in a profession, that I kind of transitioned out of by working in philanthropy.
Okay, awesome. Yeah. So inspiring. I mean, clearly there's so many different paths, and I think that the fact that we all have the common thread of feeling like an outsider in our own profession because of our Blackness, but how we have pivoted and still made way for ourselves, I think is very inspirational, and just goes to show you just how resilient we are and how we're still committed to changing our communities for the betterment of our people. And that is truly inspiring. So I want to transition into more current events that have been happening. Clearly, COVID-19, this whole pandemic, there's a little pandemic outside, even though people aren't wearing masks, there's still a pandemic outside. And, it has really come through our communities and really made and destroyed lives, taken lives. Like, I've had family members who have died from COVID, family, friends. And so, it continues to hit Black and Brown communities really hard all over the US. And clearly it's not just about a sickness or a respiratory disease, but then also the health systems that are also racist. And when we go to get treatment, not getting the correct treatment, or those preconditions that they say, like, oh yeah, that this person who has diabetes and hypertension is not going to get, the life-saving mechanism to keep them breathing. Well, I mean, what Black person doesn't have hypertension at this point? So like it's clearly very racial and it's very obvious, right? That we are being, not only are we the essential workers on the front line, but then when we go to get treatment, we're also being discriminated against. And so I just want to ask you guys, in your respective communities, Los Angeles, Philly, Detroit, in what ways have you seen or have you been affected by COVID personally as a Black person, because you're still a Black person in this world? And then also, like, how do you see the long-lasting effects in these communities from an urban planning perspective? I mean, our communities are already divested in and already, suffering in a myriad of ways. And then now COVID has come and hit our communities even harder. So, Matt, do you want to start this one?
Yeah, sure. I mean, it's heavy. I really can't, I can speak to this personally. I'm still processing, honestly. It's ongoing. I mean, it hasn't stopped. It'd be much easier to take a pulse on what's next if we're able to actually stop the pandemic, but it's ongoing. Personally, it's been just seeing up close and personal, the ways that these, the sort of ignorance around science in our society right now, the ignorance around health, or even indifference to it in some ways, combined with unfettered power and corruption, that really makes me just feel all kind of ways. One way that it's come out personally is like, I thankfully haven't had family members, blood related at least, that have passed away in this sort of pandemic, but my partner has, and his sister contracted it. She thankfully survived, but his great aunt passed away, who lived, in the nursing home across the street from our church. She was 92, had lived a long life, but it was just like, that's such a terrible way to go out. And it's really just a terrible sickness, physically, and so that really was something that was traumatic for him, and having to process that with him. But also, like, you know, so where it has affected me and my family, I lost my grandmother 3 weeks ago, and even though it wasn't related to COVID, it's the fact that it's happening during a time when we can't be together as a community, and it's hard to, you know, cope with each other and really, you know, trade information and best practices, and just, you know, cut through a lot of the noise that I think digital life sort of inflames right now. And so that's been really tough. And so I think that those personal elements are there. And also just like politically, in Pennsylvania, we have a very conservative, or Republican, I should say, ran state legislature, who's been going back and forth with the governor about reopening things. You know, like other cities, we've seen people, you know, going out there with weapons to sort of make demonstrations of their disdain for the stay-at-home orders. And that's been scary. But what's been most scary is that people that are in power, who know all the science, know all the ways that this can hurt people, and yet still decide to perform as if they don't know. That really bothers me and makes me sick. And thankfully it didn't make me physically sick, but one of the state legislators in Pennsylvania, we called it the COVID cover-up, he had it, still came to the state legislature, and because they're in control, they can make people come to session, and they work in small quarters. My partner's in a lot of those, you know, sort of really important committees. And when he found out, like, you know, we both had to go get tested, and I'm glad I got tested, but it was just the fear of, like, what if I had it and I was following all the right things, you know, staying at home, and, like, you know, boom. And so I've been really, it's just been traumatic. Yeah, it's been a lot of trauma and anxiety about, like, am I doing the right things to protect myself? How are my family doing? How's the community doing? Yeah, I don't know. As far as just like long term, I mean, I don't know, it's hard to say. I think that there's certainly a lot of, I'm thinking about it from the lens of economic development. So a lot of small business owners who were already marginal and already sort of struggling to get ahead or to keep their businesses afloat, are not getting access to the Small Business Administration loans at the same rates as their peers. They aren't, you know, getting PPE, private protective equipment to, you know, address these different risks with their coworkers who are considered essential. And so it's just, it feels like it's setting us back. It feels like sort of a type of, you know, a Reconstruction era of sorts. Like, I see some people processing it as like a reset in a way, like, oh, like now I can like have time to do different things, and like, you know, recommit myself to things I've been putting off. And I empathize with that to an extent, because thankfully I have a job where I don't have to like be out and interact with people on a face-to-face basis. But it feels like Reconstruction for a lot of other people that are trying to make it. So I'll stop there. I'm really curious about how everybody else is feeling about where this is going for them.
Yeah, I think, you know, as a planner, I have concerns about, you know, the fiscal health of Detroit. You know, we were the largest city in the country to declare bankruptcy. You know, we get an inordinate amount of revenue each year from the casinos. And so the casinos were one of the last establishments to close, you know, in the state. And so, you know, our mayor is predicting, you know, hundreds of $1 million shortfall for our city. And we aren't out of the clear yet. We aren't done with, you know, the Fiscal Oversight Board. So I think, you know, long term for Detroit, you know, this issue of, you know, financial health as a city is still important. We're still facing, you know, challenges with, you know, our tax rates as property owners. You know, we do have the eviction stay, but that is not going to be long term. You know, Detroit, had a, vacant property campaign that was somewhat successful, but we still have the highest rate of tax foreclosure in the country on residential housing, even though we know that our tax rates were inflated. So if we think about long-term, impact on COVID, does this really wash away, any of the economic gains that, we've talked about as a city? And even still with Detroit being, labeled the next Brooklyn and, on the cover of every major newspaper and magazine, there was still a sense that, Native Detroiters and Black people in the city weren't getting an equitable opportunity to participate, in that economic resurgence. And so COVID, has taken the wind out of that and exposed that disparity, even more. Someone put, how is the water in Flint? We still have our challenges, in Flint with, with water quality. So, racism, structural racism, social determinants of health, those were pandemics before COVID. I think COVID has shone a light, on those racial disparities here in Detroit even more. And we're gonna have to figure it out. We're gonna have to figure out what that even looks like as a state when we talk about revenue. And so just politically, is there a bailout for states and for cities? And so hearing people say, well, states should just declare bankruptcy. What does that look like, within our country if, our governmental entities aren't able to provide, basic services at a large scale across the country?
All of those things. I think personally, I know a few people who have lost their lives to COVID-19, but actually the impacts that I'm seeing in my life and in my perimeter are just around the ripple impacts that COVID-19 is having, whether they're economic, more importantly. And I think for me, the beginning of the process was very triggering because when we are in a recession, right? And the last recession really hit my family very hard. And so a lot of feelings and fear and anxiety came up for me. But, I'm thankful that I am, still employed, and amongst my family, for folks who may be impacted, we are able to take care of each other. So that's been a blessing. But then there's, just things with the healthcare system where we already have a hard time getting proper care. But, I have a family member who has lupus, which apparently the same medicine they are helping to treat COVID-19 with is the same medicine that a lot of Black women in particular rely on for lupus. And so having to go and fight with a healthcare provider about getting an adequate prescription, it's unfathomable. It doesn't make any sense. But, and I think work-wise, it's been challenging. And I try to always see the opportunity in things, right? But when you're in public service, you don't necessarily, you got to respond to the crisis immediately. And sometimes we don't even have enough information to decide. And I know that's sometimes hard for the general public to understand, but literally, unfortunately, our country did not do enough to prepare for COVID-19. And so a lot of information we're learning as we go. So that's been very frustrating. And yes, we do not get time off, to Ivory's point. So, on one hand, it's a crisis. Sometimes crises can present an opportunity. So one of the things that I'm really proud we were able to do here in LA was a senior meal program with businesses in South LA. So to get meals to our seniors who needed to be homebound. So, we're finally starting to see more restaurants open in South LA that are serving healthy food that are owned by people who are from South LA. And it was important that we didn't let this pandemic come and wipe them out. So we created a system by which we had 30 different restaurants supplying daily meals to seniors, up to 3,000 seniors by the time we wrapped our program. And we just closed it out last week, where, any other time we were able to take public resources and get that funding to businesses for them to do that. Other times people have to go through so many hoops to get registered to do business with the city. It don't make no sense. It's frustrating. So, you know, we were able to like kind of see that window of opportunity and be able to remove some of the red tape to be able to have that program. But then, you know, on the other hand, I'm looking at how we're handling our housing crisis and how we are, you know, how the housing crisis is being exacerbated by COVID-19. And it's frustrating. Like, yes, you know, Los Angeles has been able to put a moratorium in place to stay evictions and at least give tenants the right to have a year to pay back their rent. But the reality is, if you live in day to day and check to check and you lose your job,
Right.
and then I finally get a job 3 months later, where's 3 months of rent coming from? Like, and, you know, and so, you know, on one hand, things present an opportunity, but what I've really seen in the housing landscape, because unfortunately our country is, most of the wealth in our country is founded and tied to real estate. You know, we haven't really been able to address the housing crisis in the way that it needs to be done because it's driven by capitalism. And so when it, you know, while there was an opportunity there to support our businesses, it's been really hard to get policy or resources that are going to keep people in their homes and keep them stable, and then just address the larger issue we have with affordable housing in LA. So, you know, it's a give and take some days, and I just sometimes have to remind myself, like, it's not going to be perfect. We got to keep, you know, we keep pushing and we keep pushing. And so, you know, sometimes being able to see those opportunities and also just being frustrated when the opportunities aren't necessarily coming through. And that's definitely been where I am at on housing in particular.
Okay. Yeah. I mean, yeah, we've seen it definitely here in Chicago. A lot of our communities are hard hit, a lot of our businesses. And again, we have not even gotten into the mass evictions that are about to happen in our communities, and we are not prepared for it. And so, yeah, something for us to think about as practitioners, especially since housing is one of the main things that we deal with on a day-to-day basis. How are we going to keep people housed? Especially since in this country, homelessness is made criminal. And so that will kind of go and lead into our next question. And just to time check, I want to do about 20 more minutes of our discussion and then open it up because I know I want to be mindful of time. So, you know, over the last few weeks, we've seen uprising in all 50 states and at least 17 countries in support of Black Lives Matters, and condemning state-sanctioned murders by the hands of police. You know, I think I was 10 years old when I saw my mother get beat by 2 white officers. I did not have the luxury of not knowing that police brutality wasn't a thing, or that institutional racism wasn't a thing, or having the opportunity to ever think that police truly served and protected our communities. I've just never had that privilege. And that has also shaped my relationship with government and with the built environment in my place, you know, in this industry, and how I decide to proceed in creating spaces that are safe for our people. And so, you know, during these times, we've seen, you know, protesters, we've seen rioters, and we've seen looters. And there is a difference between all three of those things. So I know that the media likes to conflate them, but those things are different. And so we've seen buildings being burned, we've seen buildings being destroyed, we've seen businesses being looted in our own communities, right? And so, like, this is a question that I like to broach, one, from a personal perspective of how you feel about protesters, rioters, and looters. We've seen riots in in almost all of our major cities, you know, 1960s, early 1900s. We've seen it happen time and time again, but we've also seen the divestment that has happened time and time again after those incidents. But then also, as a Black urban planner, how does that make you feel? You know, like dealing with the built environment and knowing that history and knowing that we get divested in for doing nothing. And so, like, you know, with the destruction of some of our businesses, how does that affect you personally and then also professionally?
Yeah, I think I wanted to just say that I think language is powerful, right? And so, you know, being here in Detroit, you learn really quickly the difference between, you know, protesting, rioting, and insurrection. You know, just as you talk about, you know, the protest and the insurrections that happen here in Detroit. And so we, you know, as a community have that history. I think we've seen some interesting responses to what's happened in other cities across the country. You know, Detroit did not have, you know, any looting or, you know, any burning. And, you know, our businesses downtown, a lot of them, you know, boarded up, expecting for there to be, you know, violence and destruction of property. And so I think people here within the community, within the built environment, you know, real estate or community development, they see that as a win, right? And so what we saw was a sense of ownership, right? Really promoted by, I would say, our political leadership, you know, our mayor saying, you know, this is our city, right? We're not going to tear up our city. However, you had, you know, Black people saying, well, is it our city, right? Black people don't own property downtown, you know. Black people don't have, you know, the real estate holdings in downtown Detroit. So should we be looting? Should we be burning? Are we really investing here? Are we invested? Are people invested in us? You know, I think, you know, for me, I've learned through this process that maybe I'm a little bit more militant, you know, than other Black people. You know, I just don't believe in policing Black anger. I don't believe in policing how, as Black people, we choose to respond to oppression and racism and violence and murder. We've seen, you know, peaceful protest, right? You can go back to Colin Kaepernick and how he was treated. So it's like, what do you want? What is the appropriate way, right, for Black people to express how, you know, 40 years of oppression has made us feel, you know? And I have a colleague here in Detroit, and she's, you know, a white woman who considers herself an ally. And she would always say, you know, Kalia, to be totally honest, if Black people wake up one day and they decide that they've had enough and they start killing us in our sleeps, what as white people could we actually say, right? So she was saying she always felt that Black rage had its place, and she was always shocked that there wasn't more anger from Black people, that there wasn't more rage, right? She was like, I don't understand how Black people are able to exist in this world and in this country based on how you've been treated. But for me, I don't want to police you know, our community and how we respond to what happened. So yes, it's great that Detroit hasn't had, you know, any looting, any violence. But, you know, if that were to happen, I'm not going to point to Black people, or, you know, as we know, there's also been instigators, right? You know, in some communities, I'm not going to point to Black people. What I'm going to point to is the system, right, that has produced this. And I think that's the difference.
Mm. Okay.
Yeah, Khalilah, you've said a lot of things that hit resonating with the people. I see it coming in. I love it. No, I think there's, you know, there's so much here. So I hadn't really experienced police, you know, brutality growing up. You know, and I had my experience with it in a very odd way. I was celebrating my PhD graduation, and I was in my apartment, and we were playing music. We were like swag surfing, and like we had been quiet the whole time. I mean, we were so good for a Friday night, and like that was like the thing that broke the camel's back, and we just all like started swag surfing. So it could have been more than like 9 p.m. or something. And I get a knock on the door, and it's 2 police officers, and they said, we got a call from, you know, someone with a noise complaint. And I was like, I answered the door, and it was just shocking because I was like, okay, I know all of my neighbors, you know, and we made a point, me and my roommate, to talk to everybody. And so like, why couldn't they have just come to us and just tell, hey, it's too loud. And for me, that's it, that sort of, that example sits with me a lot in terms of what is policing for? Mm-hmm. Policing is a tool to enforce a worldview, a taste, if you will, as to what counts as law and what counts as order. And for a long time as Black people, we're seen as inherently disorderly because we differ from the norm. We differ from the majority. And so for me, it's there's a lot in this moment that is ripe for reimagining and to sort of unlock. And I think, like you said, Black rage has its place. I think we all have a role to play in this moment. And what I want to see is that we all respect each other's roles, because we're fighting for the same thing. We're fighting for liberation. We're fighting for freedom. And I think, like, you know, right now, I know, Nina, you said to be mindful of getting our points out, because there's a lot on this topic. I'm like, I really want to make sure I say everything I need to say. I think this is a moment for us to be proud of the way in which Black rage has been converted so quickly into reforms. There's been, I mean, for a year here in Pennsylvania, there were bills, you know, that had been sitting on the books that Republicans knew about, the Black Caucus here knew about, and had been pushing for, but there was no political will for. And this has unlocked that. In 1 week, we've seen like 17 out of the 19 bills get passed in the legislature, at least go up for a vote. That's been a tool that they've been using for a long time to just prevent anything from going up for a vote. And so they've gone up for a vote. They've been passed. And so I think, like, that's great. That's progress. I think where some of the tension I'm seeing is that we as a Black community, because of, you know, segregation, because of displacement, because of dispersion even into cities, we don't often have a chance to sit as a community and talk about these issues amongst ourselves and strategize. And when I talk about different roles we need to play, agitate, educate, organize. Like, some of us are agitators. That's all we got the energy for. Like, I'm not finna sit here and explain this to white people or explain this to, you know, everybody else. I just want to register my frustration. I'm moving on. Other folks like myself are educators. Like, we're trying to process this information. We're trying to send it off to the right people who we know are in control of these systems. And some of us are in charge of systems ourselves. University of Pennsylvania, we're having a really deep discussion right now about private policing, which is something we have not talked about as a society yet. Like, we've not yet figured out what to do about the Trayvon Martins of the world, of, you know, private militias and private police forces being able to just kill people. And so that's a second role. But then there's organizers. And I think, like, when we funnel all of that rage and that information into a strategy, you know, it needs to happen on a timeline. And, like, I feel like that's what I'm really looking forward to, is just seeing all these different, you know, strains of thought come together into something that really moves, really moves the needle. Last thing, I'll shut up, is that I also feel that as planners, particularly what we have to contribute to this conversation is a real clear understanding of what investment looks like. What does that Black future look like? You know, I consider myself an Afrofuturist at times, and I really care about how do we paint the vision that we see all of ourselves in, you know, and that's why I said earlier about my role as a world builder. I think that's a really important role we haven't really elevated as much. And so, you know, I don't want us to get too caught downstream and saying, like, oh, we're gonna fix this one particular tactic or this one particular thing, and not seeing the larger vision upstream, where we're like, hey, like, there's actually a whole other worldview that's enforcing that tool of policing on us. Like, how can we get rid of that? That's what I feel like as planners, we have a real advantage in this conversation.
Yeah.
I'm going to try to be quick, and I'm trying not to repeat what's been said, because I definitely agree with Khalilah in terms of Black rage in the space and role that it plays in LA. You know, actually a couple weeks before the uprising, we were in a scenario where the mayor was proposing to cut the city department's budgets across all departments except for the police. They were actually up for an increase in their budget. And so we saw what is now kind of become defund the police, but here the people's budget was an ask that was put before the council 2 weeks prior to the uprising. And it was, you could only get a few council members to care about it. And then what we saw, you know, we saw the mayor come out and at least start to answer those demands and try to, you know, cut that budget. But there's still a lot of work to do on that front. But, you know, what I think from a planning perspective, and definitely to Nina's point, like, I was born in LA, we had our big riots in 92. I was born in 93. So I didn't live to see the riots, but I lived to see the aftermath, and I still see that aftermath on a day-to-day. I can walk by a vacant lot that has been burned since the 92 riots, and no one is investing in it, no one's doing anything about it. Here in LA, we saw, you know, people intentionally stayed out of South LA. You know, organizers made sure the protests happened elsewhere because we know the devastation that it puts on our communities. But, you know, at the same time, as a planner, if you find yourself questioning, you know, whether buildings are more important than the causes that we're demanding, I think you got to take a step back and you got to question that, because, you know, I think about all these scenarios in context of place and space. So what is it about a city that allows Trayvon Martin to be deemed suspicious, right? Like, what is it about the city and the place that allows Ahmaud Arbery to be shot while he's just trying to go for a run and be healthy, right? Like, what is it? Why is it that Chicago can lift up bridges to protect the elite's property and then send the rioters and the looters outside of, you know, into the west side or the south side of Chicago? And, you know, and just like, why is it that a Black woman is being killed in her sleep by the police? Why do we have Black trans women who, you know, like, it just, I'm getting emotional, but all I'm going to say is, I think, yes, you know, we do need to make sure we can rebuild our communities after these moments, but Black rage has a place. And we need to honor that. We need to honor the progress we are seeing because of the resistance. And as planners continue to think about the backdrop in which all these scenarios play out and how the built environment influences them, and call that out as we continue to do our work.
Yeah.
So much, yes. There's space for all of the emotions, and it's no, yeah. I mean, like, even as you were saying those scenarios, I started to feel the welling in my chest, the heaviness that I'm sure we all feel whenever we hear those stories, or think about our family members being victims to those same scenarios. Something as simple as jogging or sleeping in your bed. And so I'm just gonna go one more question, and then I'm gonna open it up to the audience. So, you know, with the protests and the rioting and the looters, we've seen, as you all have mentioned, there be an awakening from a lot of different sides of like, okay, where are we going next with policy? What are we doing? And so in response to a lot of the current events, there have been many calls to defund the police. And so what I'm going to do is define what defund the police means for those of us who are not aware, because I think there's a lot of confusion about the wording for some reason, because if you don't know how to Google defund, you may not you may not understand the concept. So, you know, for many of us, and I'm including myself in this because I do believe in defunding the police. I'm very firm in that. It means, you know, for those of us who are in favor of defunding the police, we are talking about taking funds from ballooned police budgets in a lot of our cities, and reallocating that money to social services that we have decided as a society are criminal. Things like homelessness, drug addiction, mental health, domestic disputes. A lot of those things can be taken care of if we allocated more money to social services, public education, public health. But we've decided that it would be easier to have the police deal with those situations for clearly obvious reasons, because those things disproportionately affect what groups. And, you know, so that's what we mean. That's what I mean by defund the police. And so as urban planners, I'm asking you, how do you feel about this idea? And what effect do you think defunding the police could have on our communities from an urban planning perspective?
Can I take this one first, y'all? Because I'm going to be straight to the point.
Yeah.
That's the key part. Defund the police and invest in communities. As planners, our entire jobs, our professions at least should be, and if it's not, if that's not how you operate, and again, like let's have some conversations, it should be about investing in communities and creating spaces that are safe for our communities, that aren't, you know, where people aren't overly criminalized, where we are investing in education, where we have social services centers instead of prisons being built, right? Like, so the way I look at it is, this is our moment. This is our moment as planners to step in, and as these resources are being shifted from criminalization and policing, moving it into that project that maybe you've been trying to get off the ground and you haven't been able to find the funding because political will, and get that park project built, get some affordable housing built, get the mental health centers built. Like, this is really, I think, to me, this is what our profession is about. Because even, you know, I've done work around Vision Zero in LA. Is we, as much as possible, have tried to divert money into design and, you know, proactive design to help address the problem instead of policing and speeding tickets and criminalization. And so the way I look at it, it's simple. Defund and invest in our communities. And that's what we as planners are supposed to be about. So I think this is really a moment for us to step up, support this movement, and also support the implementation of these resources as they go forward.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think as planners, we need to question, right, some of the foundations of our sector. You know, when I think back on, you know, Jane Jacobs and Eyes on the Street, and we talk about, you know, NIMBYism, and we talk about public space maintenance and the rise of public-private partnerships, right? That in the planning world, right, public-private partnerships were seen as the silver bullet, right? And I think those concepts and those structures have helped to create what we see now, right? We see the Karens of the world, right, being overly concerned about Black bodies in public spaces. And so I think as planners, we have contributed a little bit to the hyper surveillance that we see in public spaces, right? And the criminalization of, you know, people who experience homeless, right, in the name of design, in the name of public space. And that needs to be questioned. And as Black planners, I think we have, a responsibility to really look at planning through a racial equity analysis and to present back to the field how those thoughts and those structures and those initiatives and those strategies are inherently racist. And to challenge those, and then to also open up and to partner with communities, to partner with activists, to help them identify those projects that need to get, you know, off the ground. We like to talk about shovel-ready projects, right, in planning. What's ready to go? What could be, positioned for investment? And so we, whether that's through pro bono work, through volunteer boards, right, we need to step up our activism by making our skills and our technical assistance and expertise available to communities so that they're in line for the resources that will come if we and when we disband or divest from policing.
Yeah, I think I'm really in favor of, so I like that, Nina, you start this question off with how you define defunding, because as things popularize, as they become mainstream or whatever, people hijack it. And I was literally just talking about this with this other initiative happening right now in Seattle. I don't know if you haven't seen that, with the autonomous zone, and it's just like this weird space where like anarchists and other folks are coming in trying to redefine what Black people often came and started and tried to actually at the site of a police station to focus it on racial justice, and it's become this whole other thing. So I think it's really important for us to keep fast and hold fast to what our vision is. And abolition, I love how I think her name is Marina Cava. I'm maybe mispronouncing her name, but defined it as creating a world where the need for policing is obsolete. And so the way we define policing as this force that, like I mentioned earlier, eliminates any signs of disorder, enforces a property rights regime that is antiseptic to Blackness. That is really that is a world I want to see. Like, I think thank you for correcting in there, Mariam Kaba, say her name. And so I think that it's important for us to have our thumb on the pulse of the things that we need to invest in, and we have that as planners. I think like that, Kristen, your point around this is our moment, I'm totally here for that. I think where I want to add to this conversation is that there is a world where white supremacists are emboldened to use the police or any other form that they have their hands on to, sorry. We have we have a big biking culture here in Philly, so it's a little loud. So they feel emboldened to use whatever tools at their disposal to eradicate us, frankly. And so for me, I want to see a world where if we have any form of policing, it's to focus it on hate crimes and the biggest national security threat other than climate change is domestic white nationalism. Like, get to it. Like, that's what I want to hold. And I feel like the conversation, and I keep looking for this in this conversation. I'm like, when is someone going to address like the reason why the police are being violent? It's because of their racism. It's because of their unchecked, unfettered power over our lives. And like, to me, like, that's where I feel that's a very limited, targeted thing that we often get neglected from in our communities. Like, why haven't, that's where I'm really frustrated. And I feel like, okay, this whole other defunding movement will definitely free up some space, but let's not lose sight of like justice in this conversation. And we can talk about restorative justice. We can talk about whatever form of justice needs to be at the table. But like, I've been really, shaken and sort of not even dumbfounded, but just like really hyper vigilant alert to the rhetoric of our president right now, particularly, stoking these the sort of Second Amendment kind of rights of Justin Fishtown not too long ago, when our sort of civil unrest was happening. We had white folks coming out in South Philly and in Fishtown with like armed weapons, trying to basically, protect their property, even though they weren't even a target. It was just like, I see that. And so I really want us to be vigilant about how do we protect ourselves as we secure those investments from sort of defunding and, shaving off the bloated budgets that are going toward things that we would have no need for a police officer to be addressing.
Yeah, that, and also armored cars, grenade launchers. Yeah. Like, I don't understand why are they so heavily militarized? I mean, they're literally there.
And I'm sorry, Nina, just on this point too, I saw in the comments earlier, someone mentioned we owe everything to social workers. On that point, they're very critical to this sort of healing phase that a lot of people are outlining. And I want to know how we're also preparing people to go into those professions as well, like being ready to step up. Like, I think you mentioned shovel ready, Khalilah. Like, let's have some shovel ready, like social workers ready to get us off, help us heal from this trauma. I mean, there's a lot of it out there.
Because social workers are paid. So I'm not about to send a social worker out there. Like, take some of that budget and give social workers what they deserve.
Yes. Yes.
Okay, so I'm going to go ahead and dive into some questions that I'm seeing here. This one is from Soror Asia Green. She says, as someone who isn't a planner, what are the strategies or steps that I can take to become involved in investment of social services in Black communities? I'm going to insert just a little bit of an answer too, is like, I think we mentioned it earlier, is like, as planners, I see our profession as interpreters and translators. The true professionals, the true experts, I mean, not professionals, are the community. So I think, like, take your lived experience and be on your alderman's neck, be on your council person's neck. Everything evolves around capitalism and politics. That's really what makes the world go round. So if there's a community organization, there's so many community organizations in Chicago itself that you could be either, whether it be monetarily supporting or with your time supporting, with your labor, you could be, supporting with your skills, you could be supporting, and keep these elected officials and hold them accountable, because they will do and say whatever you want to hear in order to get elected, and then switch up quick once they get in office. And so that's just my little tidbit, but would love to hear from the rest of the panel.
I would also say, strengthen your advocacy skills, like you mentioned. I also think someone talked about, how are we preparing, youth, after this. And so I also think about expanding, right, the options that you present to youth, right? And really, as Black people, connecting that to the healing, right, and advocacy of our community. And so, you know, I have a good friend here, you know, her husband has launched this initiative around, you know, calling Black men into the teaching profession, right? And so that's an example of saying, hey, we need you, we need your time, we need your talent, and this is the outcome that we know that produces for our community. And so, you know, I think, you know, a lot of times, right, as Black people, if you get out of your community and you go on to college, right, your parents are looking, or your grandparents, you know, how much money are you coming out and making, right? We need you to be a doctor, a lawyer, you know, something, to be able to be in a financial position to give back. But I think, you know, this time is really calling us to think about more than just money, right? To think about what does it mean to really help heal your community and help heal, you know, future generations. And so I think presenting more options to youth, really supporting, you know, youth leadership, helping ensure that our kids really understand, you know, their history, understanding white supremacy, how it operates, what it means to be an ally, and how to create solidarity among all people of color. You know, our daughter goes to a Spanish immersion school, you know, here in Detroit, and it was important, right, that even in a city that's the largest Black city, that she understands solidarity for, you know, the kids who are in Southwest Detroit, right? And in turn, for her to be a benefactor of that solidarity through what's occurred over the past couple of, you know, months. And so I think that's really important, and we need to equip our children in different ways.
Yeah, I love this question. I think it's important to organize where you are, and use your energy where you're most passionate. And so it's hard to give general advice about this. I can give you know, examples. For instance, right now, I know in July there's going to be a big blackout day where people are trying to shop at Black-owned businesses. And that's a big part of what I studied and what you know, my first book is coming out about. And I really want to, I think like there's certain tools that we've seen used for, thank you, blackouts on the July 7th. There's so many tools that are used for just run-of-the-mill business as usual that we can sort of take and repurpose for our own needs. And so, for instance, in South LA, Leimert Park, but really all of Crenshaw, there's the Business Improvement District there. One really interesting thing I've been seeing them do is, one, they're run by a nonprofit that actually, you know, gives a damn about the neighborhood and is doing all these other things to support affordable housing and to support, you know, just the general upkeep of and social environment of that place, addressing food inequality, food deserts. But the actual business owners there and the property owners have created a business improvement district that is allowed to get money from the county to reinvest in curb appeal, which is more shorthand for just like, can we clean the streets up? Like, have somebody coming through, picking up trash, also helping with sort of facade improvements for those businesses so that it's actually appealing for people to come shop and enjoy that environment. And it's Black owned. And so it's just like, we really need to, I think sometimes these Black campaigns or initiatives sometimes are disconnected from space, and like how space works and how it functions in our liberation. And so I use that example as just one way that like, you can take that desire to want to help the community and map it onto the tools of planning and development.
Yes.
I'm gonna just say this quickly. I think for everybody who's looking to get more involved and step up, my whole thing is keep that same energy, sustain that energy, because right now we're gonna see organizations who are getting an influx of money, and an influx of people looking to volunteer, but the real work happens a year from now.
That's
which
right.
We don't want to hear. It's going to happen 2 years from now. It happens a decade from now. And so this is the fight for Black liberation isn't going to be over in 2 months. I know right now it's easier for a lot of us to stand up and to advocate because maybe, you know, COVID, the world slowed down. But I think it's important that we all find a way to integrate this into our daily lives in a way that works for us. Be mindful of not burning out, but keep that same energy, sustain that energy, and continue to show up at these organizations, because it's one thing if we all show up 20,000 deep on Hollywood Boulevard. It's another thing if we can do the same thing next year. And these organizations continue to get that support and have that capacity to carry out their work.
Absolutely. Oh my gosh, we are 2 minutes from the time. I just want to say, man, thank you, thank you, thank you. I just love us, Black people. Like, come on. And Kristen, to your point about doing the work, for a lot of us, Black teachers, Black social workers, Black planners, like, we've been doing the work. We come into these industries and are literally carrying the DEI principles on our back. And I think, if there are allies watching, don't let this be just a moment. I know that a lot of you, not all of you, a lot of you have just now woken up to this. This has been our reality. And I want you to keep that same energy, okay? When you see your Black coworker being overtalked, or you hear your white coworker make a racist comment, or you see how if you're there's a policy that needs to be pushed, and your Black coworker is fatigued, and you need to push it and speak up, when you see an all-white panel and they invite you, say no. Say no. It's like the little baby steps of what you can be doing. And I wish we had time to answer some of the other questions, but we don't. But either way, I just want to leave this and say, again, thank you to all the speakers. Thank you for your time. Thank you for your knowledge. Thank you for your wisdom. And to everybody in the audience, thank you for taking the time to be with us today. Again, if you or your employer wants to contribute to the GoFundMe, so that we can help these organizations across the nation, that's awesome. If you want more information, this will be posted on YouTube. So we are recording, and this will be posted on YouTube if you want to watch it later or share with others. And with that, I'm going to go ahead and end and just say, everyone have a good night and take care of yourselves. All right.
You too, Nina. Thank you for having us.
Bye.
Thank you.
Shout out to Nina, y'all. Let's not
Shout out.
Yes.
Thank you.
Oh, thank you.
She puts on for the community and her hair.
Sometimes you gotta show out.
Right, we need to get a picture. This is,
You know what? We should.
Natural hair.